The first time I heard my father beg for mercy. He was standing in front of cameras outside the county courthouse, sweat dripping down his neck despite the cold October wind. "Daniel," he hissed at me through clenched teeth, trying to keep a smile for the reporters, "you have no idea what you're doing." But I did. By then, the military records had already been verified. The hidden tapes had already been copied. And the story my grandfather had carried in silence for 70 years was finally crawling into the daylight like something too heavy to stay buried anymore. My father looked terrified. Not angry. Terrified. And standing there in that crowd of reporters and veterans, I suddenly remembered the last thing my grandfather ever said to me before he died. "Don't let them find it first." At the time, I thought he was confused from the morphine. Turns out, he knew exactly what he was talking about. 3 months earlier, none of this existed in my life. Back then, I was just a tired 58-year-old man driving an aging Ford pickup through western Pennsylvania every Sunday morning to visit an old Korean War veteran everyone else had forgotten. My grandfather, Walter Harper, lived in a nursing home outside Altoona. It wasn't the worst place in the world, but it wasn't far from it either. The wallpaper curled near the ceilings. The hallways smelled faintly like bleach and canned soup. Half the television sets were stuck on cable news 24 hours a day. The nurses did what they could. Most of them were kind, overworked, but kind. Still, it wasn't where a man like Walter deserved to end up. Not after the life he'd lived. The sad thing was, if you met him, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything special at all. My grandfather was quiet. Not bitter, not angry, just quiet. He wore old flannel shirts buttoned to the top. He drank weak coffee. He folded newspapers neatly after reading them. He tipped waitresses too much and never complained about anything. If somebody thanked him for his military service, he'd nod once and change the subject. That was Walter Harper, a man who spent his whole life carrying things silently. My parents, on the other hand, treated him like an inconvenience that refused to die. My father, Richard Harper, owned a successful legal consulting firm near Pittsburgh. My mother spent most of her time at charity luncheons pretending to care about people she'd never speak to twice. They lived in one of those giant stone houses where nobody actually sat in the living room. And somehow over the years they convinced themselves that Grandpa Walter embarrassed them. Maybe because he never made much money. Maybe because he still talked like a working man. Or maybe because old age reminds certain people of things they'd rather not face. Whatever the reason, they stopped visiting him years ago. At first it was excuses. Work. Travel. Bad weather. Then eventually, nothing. No calls. No birthdays. No holidays. Nothing except me. Every Sunday I made the drive. Sometimes Grandpa and I barely talked for 10 minutes straight. We'd sit by the window in the common room watching birds land near the parking lot feeder. Other times he'd tell little stories, never war stories. Just regular things. Fishing with his brother in 1952. His first Buick. The hardware store where he worked 30 years. The way my grandmother used to hum while washing dishes. Small memories. Quiet memories. The kind that disappear forever when somebody dies. One Sunday in November, I arrived earlier than usual because rain was coming down in sheets across Route 22. I found Grandpa sitting alone near the front window wearing his brown cardigan, waiting. I knew immediately what he was doing. "He coming?" I asked gently. Grandpa kept staring toward the parking lot. He said maybe he answered. That hurt worse than if he'd sounded angry, because there was still hope in his voice. My father never came. About an hour later, one of the nurses pulled me aside while Grandpa slept in his chair. "She worries me," I said quietly. The nurse gave me a tired look. "No," she answered softly, "he worries us." I frowned. "What do you mean?" She glanced toward the hallway before speaking. "Every Sunday morning he sits by that window waiting for family." She paused. "You're the only one who ever shows up." I didn't know what to say after that. A week later, the nursing home called me at 2:13 in the morning. By the time I arrived, Grandpa's breathing sounded shallow and uneven. The room was dark except for a small lamp near the bed. Rain tapped softly against the window. I sat beside him for nearly 3 hours. At one point he opened his eyes halfway. Cloudy blue. Weak. But clear enough to recognize me. "Danny," he whispered. "I'm here, Grandpa." His hand trembled as he reached for mine. Then his fingers tightened surprisingly hard. "There's something hidden," he whispered slowly. "In the cabin." I leaned closer. "What cabin?" "The mountain cabin." His breathing rattled painfully. "Don't let them find it first." "Who?" But he never answered. A few minutes later his breathing stopped. Just like that. No dramatic speech. No movie scene. Just silence. The nurse covered him carefully and rested her hand on my shoulder. I remember staring at the floor thinking one terrible thing over and over. Nobody should leave this world that alone. The funeral happened 3 days later. Cold gray skies, bare trees, veteran honor guard. My parents arrived 20 minutes late in a black Mercedes. My mother cried loudly when other people were watching. My father mostly checked his phone. After the burial, while people gathered near the church fellowship hall eating ham sandwiches and potato salad, I overheard my father talking to a real estate agent. "That old cabin's probably worthless," he muttered, "but the land might still sell." Something inside me hardened when I heard that. Not rage exactly. Something colder. That evening, the lawyer handling Grandpa's estate called me aside. "There's something unusual," he said. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a single key, and paperwork transferring ownership of Walter Harper's old mountain cabin entirely to me. Not my father, me. At the bottom of the page was Grandpa's shaky signature. Under it, he'd written one sentence by hand. "He'll understand." I didn't understand anything yet. But 3 days later, I packed my truck and drove toward the mountains of West Virginia, straight toward the secret my grandfather had protected his entire life. The road into West Virginia narrowed the farther south I drove. By the time I crossed the state line, the 4-lane highway had given way to winding mountain roads, lined with bare trees and old gas stations that looked untouched since the Reagan administration. Rain drifted across the hills in soft gray curtains. I kept hearing my grandfather's final words in my head. "Don't let them find it first." The strange thing was, Grandpa Walter had never been dramatic a single day in his life. He wasn't the type to invent mysteries, which meant whatever he'd hidden in that cabin mattered enough for him to carry it to his deathbed. I stopped once for coffee outside Clarksburg. The waitress called everybody hon and refilled my cup 3 times without asking. 2 old men argued about the Steelers near the counter while country music crackled softly through ceiling speakers. Normal life. Ordinary life. And meanwhile, I was driving towards something that already felt bigger than I understood. The cabin sat nearly 40 minutes off the main road, tucked deep into the mountains near an old trout stream Grandpa used to fish when I was a kid. The gravel driveway was half washed out from years of neglect. When I parked the truck, silence settled around me so completely I could hear water dripping from pine branches. The place looked smaller than I remembered. A 1-story cabin with faded green paint, a rusted tin roof, and a crooked front porch, leaning slightly to one side. One shutter hung loose beside the front window. Nobody had lived there full-time in years. Still, standing there brought back memories I hadn't thought about in decades. Summer evenings catching fireflies. My grandmother frying bacon in the tiny kitchen. Grandpa teaching me how to split firewood without smashing my fingers. Back then, the cabin felt safe. Now it felt like walking into somebody's unfinished confession. The front door groaned when I unlocked it. Cold air spilled out, carrying the smell of cedar wood dust, old paper, and faint traces of pipe tobacco. Nothing had changed. Not really. The same plaid sofa still sat near the stone fireplace. Old fishing magazines remained stacked beside Grandpa's recliner. A small radio rested on the shelf near the kitchen, exactly where he'd always kept it. It felt less like entering an empty building and more like stepping into a paused life. I stood there quietly for almost a full minute before moving. "You really kept everything," I muttered softly. Outside wind brushed against the trees. Inside the cabin answered only with silence. I spent the first few hours cleaning, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. I opened windows to let stale air out, swept dead leaves off the porch, tossed spoiled canned food from the kitchen cabinets. Every room carried little pieces of my grandfather, folded wool blankets, neatly labeled tool drawers, coffee tins filled with screws and nails, a stack of old letters tied together with twine. That part hit me harder than I expected. Most of the envelopes came from veterans organizations, reunion invitations, military newsletters, thank you letters from other old servicemen. Many were unopened. Not because Grandpa didn't care. I think he simply stopped believing his own life mattered enough to revisit. Late that afternoon, I found an old photograph tucked inside a Bible near the bedroom. 3 young soldiers stood together in winter uniforms somewhere overseas. One of them was Grandpa Walter. I barely recognized him. Young, sharp jaw, confident eyes, and unlike the quiet old man I knew, this version of him looked dangerous. On the back, somebody had written in faded ink, "Chosin Reservoir 1951. Underneath that, "Not all heroes came home." I stared at the photograph a long time. Growing up, my grandfather never talked about Korea. Not once. If anybody asked, he'd usually say something simple like, "Cold place," then he'd change the subject. That silence suddenly felt heavier now. Toward evening, I built a small fire in the stone fireplace. Rain tapped softly against the roof while flames cracked through dry cedar logs. For the first time since the funeral, exhaustion finally caught up with me. I sat in Grandpa's recliner holding a cup of coffee and listening to the cabin settle around me. That's when I noticed the scratches. At first I thought they were marks from moving furniture. But the grooves along the wooden floor near the fireplace looked too deliberate. Long scrape marks, repeated. Like something heavy had been dragged back and forth many times. I leaned forward slowly. What the hell? The cast iron stove beside the fireplace looked older than the rest of the room. Massive thing. Probably weighed 400 pounds. And suddenly I realized something strange. The scrape marks stopped directly beneath it. My pulse quickened. I set the coffee down and crouched beside the stove. Dust coated everything except one small metal edge near the floor. Recently touched. I reached down carefully and felt a hidden iron latch. For a second I actually hesitated. Part of me wanted to leave it alone. Whatever Grandpa hid here had stayed hidden for decades. Maybe some secrets were supposed to stay buried. Then I remembered my father talking about selling this place before Grandpa was even cold in the ground. That thought hardened me again. I pulled the latch. A dull metallic click echoed beneath the floorboards. Then, slowly, part of the stone wall shifted inward. My stomach dropped. Behind the fireplace was a narrow, hidden doorway descending into darkness. Cold air drifted upward, carrying the smell of earth metal and something old. Very old. I grabbed the flashlight from my truck and stood at the top of the hidden stairs for nearly a full minute listening to my own heartbeat. Jesus Christ, Grandpa. The steps creaked beneath my boots as I descended. The underground room wasn't large. Maybe 12 feet across. Concrete walls, low ceiling, no windows. But the moment my flashlight swept across the room, I knew this wasn't some old storage cellar. Military crates lined one wall. Real military crates. Stamped markings. Government labels. Dates from the early 1950s. A steel cabinet stood locked in the corner beside several oilskin-wrapped bundles. Maps covered part of a wooden table. Korean maps. Military coordinates. Handwritten notes. My breathing grew shallow. None of this made sense. My grandfather had spent 30 years working at a hardware store in Pennsylvania. How did a man like that end up hiding classified military materials beneath a cabin in West Virginia? Then my flashlight landed on something sitting alone atop the desk. A small cassette recorder. Beside it rested one carefully labeled tape. Written in Grandpa's handwriting were 5 simple words. For my grandson only. My hands actually shook as I inserted the cassette. For several seconds, static crackled softly through the tiny speaker. Then I heard his voice. Not the weak voice from the nursing home. A younger voice. Stronger. Steadier. "Danny, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone." The room suddenly felt colder. And deep in my gut, I realized my grandfather had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. "Danny, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone." The cassette hissed softly between words. I sat frozen in that underground room beneath the cabin while my grandfather's voice echoed through the darkness like somebody speaking from another lifetime. Outside wind rattled branches against the roof overhead. "I suppose that means Richard didn't come," Grandpa continued quietly. He let out a tired little breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "No, I don't imagine he would." I swallowed hard. Even now after death, he still sounded more disappointed than angry. The tape clicked briefly. Then his tone changed. More serious. "What you're about to learn has been buried a very long time. Some men wanted it buried because they were ashamed. Others buried it because they were afraid." I looked around the hidden room again. Military crates, maps, government markings. Fear suddenly crept into me for the first time. Not curiosity anymore. Fear. "I never told you these things because I wanted you to have a peaceful life," Grandpa said. But peace built on lies doesn't stay peaceful forever. The tape ended abruptly. Just like that. No explanation. No details. Only silence. I sat there staring at the cassette recorder while cold air pressed around me. Then slowly I stood and began opening the crates. Inside the first one were stacks of military folders wrapped carefully in waxed paper. Official reports. Mission summaries. Names blacked out in heavy ink. Most were stamped. Classified. Some pages had obviously been damaged by age and moisture, but enough remained readable to make my pulse race. Again and again I saw references to January 1951. Northern Korea. Emergency extraction operation. Casualty suppression. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Unauthorized recovery mission. I didn't fully understand any of it yet. But one thing became painfully clear. My grandfather had not been an ordinary infantryman. Near the back of the room stood a steel filing cabinet locked with a rusted padlock. I used an old hammer from upstairs to break it open. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes arranged neatly by date. And photographs. Dear God, the photographs. Snow-covered mountains. Young soldiers carrying wounded men through blizzards. Burned vehicles abandoned beside frozen roads. One picture showed several exhausted Marines standing near makeshift stretchers. In the center stood my grandfather, younger than I'd ever seen him, holding a rifle, eyes hollow from exhaustion. On the back, someone had written, "Hell itself froze over here." I sank into the old wooden chair beside the desk. For most of my life, Grandpa Walter had seemed almost invisible to the world. Now, pieces of another man were emerging from the dark right in front of me. A man nobody had ever told me about. I listened to another tape. This one was different. Not a private message. More like a recorded testimony. "My name is Walter Harper," Grandpa said firmly. "Corporal, United States Army. Attached temporary support detail during the Chosin operation." A long pause followed. Then, "This statement is being recorded in case the truth never reaches the families." I felt chills crawl up my arms. He began describing the winter of 1950 during the Korean War. Temperatures dropping 30 below zero. Frostbite. Starvation. Chinese forces surrounding American troops. Men freezing to death in foxholes before sunrise. I'd studied some of it in school decades earlier, but hearing it from my grandfather's own voice made it feel horrifyingly real. Then he finally described the mission. An American convoy carrying wounded soldiers had been caught during a retreat near the Chosin Reservoir. Command ordered evacuation of surviving personnel only. Too many enemy forces. Too dangerous to return. But according to Grandpa, several wounded men had been left behind alive. One of them happened to be the son of a powerful United States senator. For a moment, the tape crackled with silence. Then Grandpa spoke more quietly. Command wanted the situation buried fast. Couldn't risk word spreading that Americans were abandoned. I leaned forward. "But we knew those boys were still alive," he continued. "We heard their radio calls ourselves." My chest tightened. Grandpa explained that official orders prohibited any rescue attempt. Too risky. Too costly. Mission over. Move south. Forget the dead. But 3 soldiers refused. Walter Harper, a Marine named Frank Delaney, and another soldier called Eddie Blackburn. Against direct orders, they returned into enemy territory during a blizzard to retrieve the wounded men. Listening to it, I could almost see them. 3 exhausted young Americans dragging themselves through snow and darkness because they couldn't live with leaving others behind. Grandpa's voice shook slightly as he described reaching the trapped soldiers. "They were freezing," he whispered, barely conscious. Some crying for their mothers. I closed my eyes. For several seconds, only static played through the recorder. Then came the line that stayed with me forever. "We brought back who we could. Not all. Who we could." The rescue succeeded partially. Several wounded men survived, including the senator's son. But 2 rescuers died during extraction. Frank Delaney froze to death after giving his coat to another soldier. Eddie Blackburn was shot covering their retreat. Grandpa survived, and because he survived, he carried the weight of it the rest of his life. The tape continued. When we returned, command ordered silence, said the mission never happened, said the country needed heroes, not scandals. I clenched my jaw listening. Those men risked everything to save abandoned Americans, and instead of honor, they were erased. Another tape revealed even more. The rescued senator's son eventually became a powerful federal judge. The military buried records to protect reputations. Families of the dead rescuers were told incomplete stories. No medals, no recognition, nothing, just silence. I suddenly understood why Grandpa spent his life so quietly. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. He was exhausted from carrying it alone. Hours passed without me realizing it. Rain hammered the cabin roof overhead while I sorted documents across the underground table. Then I found something that changed everything again. A sealed envelope addressed in my father's handwriting. The date was from 1998. My hands tightened opening it. Inside was a short typed letter. "Dad, if you move forward with this, people far more powerful than either of us will get involved. Let it die peacefully. You cannot help those families anymore. You will only destroy what's left of this family. Richard." I stared at the page. My father knew. Not recently. Not accidentally. He had known for decades. Suddenly, dozens of old memories shifted inside my head. The arguments between Dad and Grandpa during holidays. The years they barely spoke. The tension nobody explained. This wasn't ordinary family resentment. My father had actively tried to stop him. A terrible sickness settled in my stomach. Had they abandoned Grandpa because they were embarrassed? Or because they were afraid of what he might reveal? I rubbed both hands across my face and looked around the hidden room again. All those years in the nursing home. All those lonely Sundays. And beneath this cabin sat enough evidence to shake powerful people. I finally understood what Grandpa meant. Don't let them find it first. Because somebody else already knew it was here. And suddenly, for the first time since arriving at the cabin, I realized I might not be alone anymore. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak in the cabin sounded different after discovering the hidden room. The mountains outside no longer felt peaceful. They felt watchful. Around midnight, I locked every door and pulled the curtains shut before returning underground with another lantern and a legal pad. I needed to organize what I'd found. Needed to think clearly. But the deeper I dug through Grandpa's files, the worse my stomach felt. There were military maps marked with handwritten coordinates. Private correspondence between officers. Names crossed out. References to sealed congressional inquiries. And over again, mentions of powerful people who wanted the rescue operation forgotten permanently. At nearly 2 a.m, I found another cassette labeled, "Richard, if you ever decide to do the right thing." My father's name. I slid the tape into the recorder. For several seconds, only static played. Then Grandpa spoke. "Son, if you're hearing this, maybe there's still hope for you." I actually felt anger rise hearing how gentle his voice sounded. After everything my father had done, Grandpa still spoke to him with kindness. "You were a good boy once," Grandpa continued softly, "before ambition got inside you." I leaned back slowly in the chair. "When those men died in Korea, I promised their families the truth would come someday. Not for revenge, not for politics, just dignity." The tape crackled. "You told me exposing the records would ruin careers." Maybe it would. But those boys already lost their lives. Their mothers lost sons. Their wives lost husbands. Somebody had to carry the truth for them. Then came a long silence. When Grandpa spoke again, his voice sounded tired beyond words. "But you were afraid." The tape clicked off. I stared into the darkness for a long time afterward. Not once in my entire life had my father ever talked about fear. Richard Harper projected confidence the way politicians do. Expensive suits, firm handshakes, country club voice. But now I could finally see it underneath. Fear. Not fear of Grandpa. Fear of consequences. Around sunrise, I drove into town to buy supplies. The nearest place was a small hardware and grocery store 20 minutes away, the kind with mounted deer heads on the wall and locals who still nodded hello to strangers. An elderly cashier glanced at the address on my receipt. "You staying up at Walter Harper's place?" she asked. I blinked. "You knew my grandfather." "Everybody around here knew Walter," she smiled sadly. "Quiet man, helped folks without asking for anything back." That sounded exactly like him. As she bagged my groceries, she lowered her voice slightly. "Couple men came looking for him few weeks ago." My chest tightened immediately. "What kind of men?" She shrugged. "City types, expensive coats, asked strange questions." A cold feeling spread through me. When was this? Not long before he passed. I thanked her and left quickly. The entire drive back to the cabin, my hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. Somebody had already been searching, which meant Grandpa knew time was running out. Back at the cabin, I decided to confront my father directly. I called him around noon. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Daniel?" No warmth, no grief, just irritation. "We need to talk," I said. A pause. "About what?" "About Grandpa." Another pause. Then colder. "What about him?" I took a slow breath. I found the hidden room. Silence. Not confused silence. Not surprised silence. Guilty silence. My heart started pounding. Finally, Dad spoke again, voice lower now. "You need to leave that place immediately." There it was. No denial. No questions. He already knew. I found the records. I continued carefully, the tapes, everything. "Daniel," he snapped, "you have absolutely no idea what you're interfering with. You knew the whole time." His breathing grew heavier through the phone. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Your grandfather destroyed his own life chasing ghosts." Ghosts. That's what he called dead soldiers. Something inside me turned hard as stone. "He spent his final years alone," I said quietly. "Did you ever even visit him once?" Dad ignored the question. "Listen carefully to me," he said. Pack whatever you found and give it to me. Today. Why? Because there are people connected to this who will not tolerate exposure. My stomach dropped. That wasn't concern. That was a warning. Who I demanded. But he'd already said too much. You think the government buried these records for 70 years by accident? His voice sharpened. You think powerful families just forget things like this? I suddenly remembered the letter from 1998. You will only destroy what's left of this family. This had never ended. Not really. Did you abandon Grandpa to protect yourself? I asked quietly. Dad exploded. You don't know what that man almost caused. His voice echoed so loudly through the phone, I had to pull it slightly away from my ear. He wanted hearings reopened, media involved, lawsuits, senators dragged through the mud, men with influence, men who built this country. I laughed bitterly. Built it on lies. You naive fool, he hissed. The world survives on buried truths. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I asked the question that truly mattered. Did Grandpa ever stop trying? Silence again. And in that silence, I got my answer. No, Dad admitted finally. He wouldn't let it go. That explained everything. The nursing home. The isolation. The distance. They didn't merely abandon him because he was old. They needed him dismissed. Powerless. Forgettable. An old veteran nobody would listen to anymore. I felt physically sick realizing it. My own parents had spent years quietly erasing him. And despite all of it, Grandpa still left the truth to me instead of destroying the family himself. Dad's voice softened suddenly, almost pleading now. Daniel, listen to me carefully. Put everything back where you found it. Walk away. Outside, wind moved softly through the pine trees. I looked around Grandpa's cabin. The fishing gear. The old photographs. The life of a man who carried unbearable things without asking anyone for pity. Then I thought about those lonely Sundays by the nursing home window, waiting for a son who never came. No, I said quietly. Dad exhaled sharply. You'll regret this. No, I answered again. I think you already do. Then I hung up. For a long moment I stood completely still holding the phone in my hand. I'd spent most of my life avoiding conflict. Working ordinary jobs. Paying bills. Keeping peace inside the family. But standing there in that little mountain cabin, I finally understood something about revenge. Real revenge isn't screaming. It isn't violence. It's refusing to keep carrying somebody else's lie. And for the first time in my life, I was ready to fight my father. The first veteran who called me cried before he could finish introducing himself. My name's Harold Delaney, the old man said through a shaky voice. Frank Delaney was my brother. I sat at the cabin table, gripping the phone tighter. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then, quietly, almost embarrassed by his own emotion, he asked, Is it true? Outside the cabin, window snow drifted softly through the mountains. Winter had finally arrived in full. I looked down at the photographs spread across Grandpa's table. Frank Delaney standing beside Walter in Korea. Young, smiling, alive. Yes, I answered softly, it's true. The old man broke down completely after that. Not loud sobbing. The kind older men do when they've spent 60 years holding something inside and finally can't anymore. My mother waited her whole life, he whispered. Whole damn life thinking Frankie died abandoned in the snow. I closed my eyes. That one sentence alone made every risk worth it. After my argument with Dad, I stopped trying to protect the family name. I contacted a military historian first, then a retired journalist from Pittsburgh who specialized in forgotten veterans' stories. At first, nobody believed me. Honestly, I couldn't blame them. An aging son claiming he discovered hidden Korean War documents beneath a mountain cabin sounded insane. But once they saw the evidence, everything changed. The historian nearly stopped breathing when I showed him the military files. These records were supposed to be sealed permanently, he muttered. The journalist asked only one question. Do you understand how big this could become? I thought about Grandpa sitting alone by the nursing home window. Yes, I answered quietly, I do. Within 2 weeks, reporters started calling constantly. Then veteran organizations. Then families. People who had spent decades believing incomplete stories suddenly realized somebody finally possessed the missing truth. And with every phone call, my anger shifted into something else. Responsibility. One snowy afternoon, I drove to Ohio to meet Harold Delaney in person. He lived alone in a small brick house filled with photographs and military memorabilia. He moved slowly with a cane, but his handshake still felt strong. The moment he saw the photograph of his brother Frank beside Grandpa Walter, tears filled his eyes immediately. "That idiot," he whispered affectionately, always trying to save everybody. We sat at his kitchen table for nearly 3 hours drinking weak coffee while he told me about Frank, how he loved baseball, how he played harmonica, how he enlisted at 19 because he thought it was the honorable thing to do. Then Harold looked at me quietly. "Your grandfather carried this all alone." I nodded. The old man stared toward the window for a long time before speaking again. "That's too heavy for one man." I think that was the moment I fully understood Grandpa's life. Not just the loneliness, the burden. Every family I contacted carried the same wound. Unanswered questions, incomplete stories, missing pieces, and all those years Walter Harper had been trying to give those families peace while powerful men worked to keep the truth buried. The first article ran 3 days before Christmas. Forgotten Korean War rescue may have been covered up for decades. By morning, every major news station in Pittsburgh had picked it up. Then national outlets followed. Suddenly, reporters crowded outside my apartment. Veteran groups demanded military review hearings. Families of dead servicemen began appearing on television holding faded photographs of young soldiers lost in Korea. And right in the middle of it all stood my father. At first, Dad denied everything publicly. These are exaggerated claims based on incomplete wartime records he told one local station. But the more evidence emerged, the worse things became for him, especially after journalists uncovered his long professional relationship with the late senator's family. That connection changed everything. Now it wasn't merely a forgotten war story. It looked like a 70-year political cover-up. One evening I watched my father on television defending himself outside his law office. He looked older suddenly, smaller. The confidence he'd worn my whole life was cracking under pressure. "Mr. Harper," one reporter shouted, "did your family intentionally silence Walter Harper?" No, Dad snapped immediately. Another reporter stepped forward. "Then why did you prevent him from speaking publicly in the 90s? Dad froze. Only for half a second, but long enough. That clip spread everywhere. For the first time in his life, Richard Harper looked afraid in public. My mother called me later that night crying. "You're destroying this family," she whispered. I almost laughed hearing it. Destroying. Number. The family was already destroyed the day they abandoned Grandpa in that nursing home. I didn't say that out loud, though. At my age, anger feels different than it did when I was young. Quieter. Heavier. "I'm not trying to destroy anybody," I told her calmly. "I'm trying to finish what Grandpa started." She cried harder after that. Part of me felt guilty. Another part remembered 70 years of silence. A few weeks later, the Army officially announced a review of the classified records. That's when everything truly exploded. More veterans came forward. One retired Marine in Arizona provided letters mentioning Walter's unauthorized rescue operation. Another surviving radio operator confirmed hearing desperate calls from stranded soldiers during the blizzard. The story was no longer deniable. And suddenly, Walter Harper, the quiet old man forgotten in a nursing home, became national news. The strangest part, Grandpa would have hated the attention. I knew that in my bones. He never wanted fame. Never wanted revenge. He only wanted the truth carried home to the families left behind. One snowy January morning, I visited the nursing home again. Not because I had to, because I needed to. The same nurse who'd cared for Grandpa recognized me immediately. "We saw him on television," she said softly. I looked confused. "Who?" "Your grandfather." She smiled gently. The veterans salute him now when his picture comes on. Something caught in my throat hearing that. The nurse walked me toward the window where Grandpa used to sit every Sunday waiting for family. "You know," she said quietly, "he never complained about them." Them. My parents. He just kept saying maybe next week. That nearly broke me. I stood there staring out at the snowy parking lot, imagining him waiting year after year for people who chose comfort over love. Then suddenly I understood something important. The real tragedy wasn't merely the war. It wasn't even the cover-up. It was what silence does to people over time. How it slowly teaches decent men they deserve to carry pain alone. That afternoon as I left the nursing home, several older veterans sitting near the entrance stopped me. One of them, a gray-haired Marine wearing a Korea veteran cap, stood slowly and saluted. Not me. My grandfather. And in that quiet moment, standing beneath the cold Pennsylvania sky, Walter Harper finally came home. The ceremony took place on a cold April morning at Arlington National Cemetery. I remember standing there beneath a pale gray sky, watching rows of white headstones stretch across the hills like silent witnesses. Bugles echoed softly through the wind. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder in pressed uniforms, despite aching knees and canes, and old wartime injuries they still carried 50, 60, 70 years later. And at the center of it all was my grandfather, Walter Harper. The quiet old man abandoned in a nursing home. The man my parents tried to erase. The man who spent most of his life believing the country had forgotten him. Now soldiers saluted his name before the entire nation. I stood near the front holding the folded program with trembling hands, while an army officer stepped toward the microphone. For extraordinary courage during the Korean War. The words washed over me slowly. Not because I wasn't listening, because part of me still couldn't believe any of this was real. A military honor guard carried Grandpa's photograph beside the podium. It was the same picture I'd found hidden in the cabin underground. Young Walter. Winter uniform. Sharp eyes staring into history. For decades, that photograph sat buried in darkness beneath a fireplace. Now cameras flashed around it. The officer continued reading the official statement. How Corporal Walter Harper voluntarily returned into hostile territory to recover wounded American servicemen. How multiple lives were saved. How acts of bravery had been omitted from official records. And finally, how this nation regrets the delay in recognizing that sacrifice. Regrets the delay. 70 years. Still, hearing it mattered. Beside me, Harold Delaney wiped tears from his cheeks openly. At his age, he no longer cared who saw him cry. Neither did I. When the medal presentation ended, several younger soldiers approached quietly asking about Grandpa. Not the scandal. Not the politics. Him. What kind of man he was. I thought about that for a moment before answering. He was the kind of man who carried painful things so other people wouldn't have to. One of the soldiers nodded slowly like he understood exactly what that meant. After the ceremony, reporters tried surrounding me again. But I was tired of cameras by then. Tired of headlines. Tired of watching people reduce 70 years of suffering into quick television segments between commercials. So I slipped away early and drove south toward West Virginia. Toward the cabin. The mountains were turning green again by the time I arrived. Dogwoods blooming. Creeks running high from spring rain. For the first time since Grandpa's death, the place felt peaceful again. Not haunted. Just quiet. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside slowly. The cabin still smelled like cedar wood and old coffee. Sunlight streamed softly through the windows. And suddenly I could almost imagine Grandpa sitting there again in his recliner listening to baseball on the radio. Not as a tragic old man. As himself. I spent several days cleaning and repairing the place properly. New roof panels. Fresh paint. Fixed porch steps. Nothing fancy. Grandpa wouldn't have wanted fancy. One afternoon, Harold Delaney visited carrying a tackle box and a 6-pack of cheap beer. We sat on the porch for hours talking about old-age war movies, arthritis, and how young people drive too fast nowadays. Ordinary conversation. Comforting conversation. At one point, Harold looked around the cabin quietly. "You selling it?" I shook my head. "Number." "What then?" I looked toward the trees for a long moment before answering. I think Grandpa would have wanted it used. That idea stayed with me. Used. Not hidden away. Not turned into vacation property for rich tourists from the city. Useful. By summer, I started working with a local veterans organization to convert the cabin into a small retreat for aging veterans who needed temporary housing or simply a quiet place to recover. Nothing huge. Just a peaceful refuge in the mountains. Fishing. Coffee. Silence. Dignity. The kind of place Grandpa himself would have loved. Volunteers came from all over. Retired carpenters. Church groups. Veterans. Even a few young college kids who said the story inspired them. Funny how truth spreads once fear stops choking it. My parents never fully recovered from the scandal. Dad's law firm lost clients. His reputation cracked permanently. We spoke only once after the Arlington ceremony. He called late at night. For several seconds, neither of us said anything. Then quietly, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard before, he asked, "Was he proud of me before all this?" The question caught me off guard. Not defensive. Not angry. Just broken. I thought about Grandpa waiting by that nursing home window every Sunday, still hoping his son would walk through the door. "Yes," I answered honestly, "I think he always wanted to be." Dad started crying softly after that. And strangely enough, I didn't feel victorious hearing it. That surprised me. For months, I'd imagined revenge would feel satisfying. But standing in the wreckage of everything, I finally understood something Grandpa probably learned long ago. Revenge doesn't heal people. Truth does. Truth gives pain somewhere to go. A few weeks later, I found myself alone in the hidden room beneath the fireplace one final time. Most of the documents had already been archived officially. The tapes copied and preserved. History finally carried into daylight where it belonged. Only one cassette remained on the desk. The private tape Grandpa made for me. I played it again. "Danny, if you're hearing this, then I'm gone." His voice filled the underground room softly. Near the end of the tape, there was a section I somehow missed the first time. Maybe because I wasn't ready to hear it yet. "A man's worth isn't measured by what he keeps," Grandpa said quietly. A pause followed. "Then, it's measured by what he's willing to carry for others." I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the old maps and faded photographs. All my life I thought strength meant winning, being respected, being successful. But Walter Harper taught me something different. Real strength is quieter than that. Sometimes it looks like sacrifice. Sometimes it looks like forgiveness. And sometimes it looks like an old man sitting alone by a nursing home window, still loving people who failed him. Before leaving the hidden room, I shut off the light and rested my hand against the doorway. "Rest easy, Grandpa," I whispered. Outside, evening sunlight spilled across the mountains in long golden bands. The wind moved gently through the pine trees. And for the first time in a very long while, everything felt still. If this story meant something to you, maybe share it with someone who still carries old wounds in silence. And if there's someone you've been meaning to call, forgive, or simply sit beside for a while, don't wait too long. Sometimes the people who say the least are carrying the most.